a lot of the history that belongs to all New Zealanders and a lot of the resources that are already ingrained in this young country should be considered. And naturally you must consider the people who have the closest contact with those resources, and that contact is the Maori people.
The Y262 claim is unusual. Almost everyone knows it either as the Y262 claim, which just means that it's the 262nd claim registered with the Waitangi Tribunal, or as the intellectual property and flora and fauna claim. Actually, if you look at the claim and the way the evidence has been presented by the claimants over the years, this is about a whole wide range of issues to do with Mātauranga Māori, colonial and Crown policies that have affected Mātauranga Māori and knowledge systems with respect to taonga of various sorts, not just flora and fauna, but of course flora and fauna is part of it. The claim is different from most claims because we associate the Waitangi Tribunal process these days either with contemporary claims about something like radio spectrum. The government says we own the radio spectrum and we're going to auction it off, and some Māori say, who says you own the radio spectrum? So that's a contemporary issue, and the tribunal can look at that and make a recommendation, which in this case the government ignored. Or we associate tribunal claims with the historic land grievances and resource grievances of the past, and those are iwi hapu specific, location specific claims and relate to particular take in particular areas. Whereas this claim, there are 6 claimant groups from all around the country, from Ngāti Kuri in the north, Te Rarawa, Ngāti Wai, Ngāti Kahununu, Ngāti Porou and Ngāti Kuata. Ngāti Kuata ki te Tauihu. So it's from the South Island right through to the tail of the fish. The claimants have come together. The claim goes back to a hui in Christchurch many years ago where discussion was going on with some DSIR scientists and some Māori, and it transpired that a Japanese scientist, Dr. Yen, had a stock of ancient kumara tubers that were held by DSIR. DSIR decided they didn't need them anymore and were going to throw them out rather than find some other home for them. And so this Japanese scientist took them home with him to Japan, and the Māori people attending that hui, including Del Wihongi, said this is disgraceful, and initially they got rather upset with Dr. Yen for having taken these taonga of Aotearoa offshore to Japan, although in retrospect I think they were rather thankful that had happened, because the tubers of these ancient stocks of kumara, which are quite different from the kumara that we buy in the shop these days, these were the kumara that were brought by the voyaging ancestors to this land and nurtured here. The claim then achieved prominence around the time of the GATT TRIPS arrangements of the Uruguay round, and in 1994 I think it was, there was some legislation being proposed to go through the New Zealand Parliament to implement the GATT, that's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which included arrangements with respect to intellectual property rights and plant variety rights and so on. So those matters were coming before Parliament. At that point, the Council for the claimants brought an application for urgency, and an application for urgency was granted. It hasn't been treated urgently since. It's now 2006, and we still haven't finished the claim. I would say the claim is the most important claim the tribunal is ever going to hear, because the key issue really comes down to whether Māori have to fit in as a indigenous minority in their own land to the systems of law and governance and intellectual property rights and language of the dominant culture, or whether there is a significant place, distinct and separate and identifiable, and it doesn't depend on the recognition of the state legal system. And that's the difficulty for this Waitangi Tribunal claim. How do they, as appointees of the government, sitting as Waitangi Tribunal members, deal with a claim which actually says there are a whole range of issues that ought to be outside the government's control, and yet still get some protection within the state legal system? Because otherwise there is no protection. Māori continue with the tikanga, but is that recognised or acknowledged by anyone else? So that's the issue. So that the claim relates to Te Tino Rangatiratanga of those hapu that have bought the claim, and iwi, in respect of the indigenous flora and fauna me o rātou taonga katoa within their respective tribal rohe. And that includes te reo, mātauranga, customs and values, whakaaro, waitapu, biological diversity, natural resources, genetics, genetic derivatives, issues to do with genetic engineering came up in this claim, Māori symbols, images and designs, who says Air New Zealand's got the right to use the koru on its tail. All sorts of issues have come up, very wide-ranging series of issues that highlight the ways in which things of value, taonga, for Māori get appropriated for the purposes of others.
This is the F-150 Lightning Rod concept vehicle, and the inspiration was Maori tattoos. And we found that to be really interesting in a couple of ways. First of all, there's a huge American culture that's into tattooing and piercing, but once we got into the Maori culture, we realized that there was also strength, and there was also the whole concept of warriors that were behind it. And we thought, wow, that has an awful lot to do with what our trucks really mean. We knew that when we did this, that it had to be a dramatic viewing. So we wanted the actual tattoo parts to be incredibly strong. So you see it on the seats, incredibly strong, bright, big, huge graphics. It's actually on the bed, on the leather bed cover, and on the ceilings, and even we put it on the brake pedals and on the accelerator pedals. But we wanted the tattoo to be very, very strong, the way they would actually be on the body. We're trying to keep our eyes wide open and our minds wide open, and we're looking for inspiration anywhere we can get it, and we thought this was a fascinating place to start.
Later in the hearings, the tribunal itself commissioned me to write a report which was a historical analysis of Crown policies. So it wasn't so much the claimant's perspective, but I was researching various Crown policies that adversely affected the transmission of Māori cultural knowledge systems. And so I just looked at the basic policies of the colonial governments through the different era since 1840. The original policy was called amalgamation, that Māori should be amalgamated into the superior British culture and practices. Later on that got called assimilation. There was some attempts to moderate the impact of assimilation with the policies of the Young Māori Party in Aparananata, used the phrase adaptation, but still pretty much within a framework where Pākehā values were dominant. Then in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the word was integration. And part of my report was to say that in some ways the period after the Second World War, the period of integration, was one of the most disastrous periods for the protection of Māori cultural knowledge systems. It was the period of dispersal to the cities, pepper potting policies of the government in the cities so that Māori would not live next door to Māori. That's what pepper potting means. You put people in houses so that that Māori are distributed amongst the general population. You don't build any community facilities, there's no marae, there's no places for ongoing transmission of knowledge. You have to go back home, which may be quite a long way away. And in any case, there were specific government policies such as the district Māori officers saying, right, we will give you some assistance to move to the city and to establish you in rental accommodation in the city. But in order to do that, first you need to make a clean break from your home area, sell up your interests in your Papakainga blocks, and then we will give you the assistance to move to the city. So this wasn't just Māori following an economic trend. This was a push by the government to move people to the city, to cut them off from their ancestral home territories, and to urge them to make a new life as integrated New Zealanders. And integrated New Zealanders somehow or other looks pretty much like try and become a brown Pākehā. The Hun report I spoke about in my review of the Crown policies, that's the report in 1960, originally commissioned by Walter Nash, the Labour Prime Minister. The idea was to close the gaps. Once the social economic disparities between Māori and the general population were closed up a little bit, then we'd all be happy. We would forget about all the treaty grievances of the past. We lived, after all, in the most happy multiracial society in the world. Mr. Holyoake told us that on many occasions, especially on Waitangi Day. So then everything would be fine, and we wouldn't have to worry about the Māori problem, because it was a Māori problem. It wasn't a Pākehā problem, it was a Māori problem, and that would be solved by these integration policies.